To win a negligence claim, a claimant has to prove three things: that the defendant owed them a duty of care, that they breached that duty, and that this breach caused damage. That first hurdle, the duty of care, asks a very basic question. Was the defendant actually under a legal obligation to protect the claimant in the first place? Before 1932, courts had a very rigid answer to that question. They generally refused to recognize a duty of care unless there was a formal, direct contract between the two parties. This meant a manufacturer could produce defective goods and avoid liability to the person who actually used them, as long as the product passed through a middleman, like a shopkeeper or a friend, before reaching the victim. Relying strictly on contracts created a significant gap in accountability. While the person who paid for a product might have had some recourse, the law offered no clear path for any other consumer injured by a manufacturer's mistake. This is a photograph of a vintage cafe from the early 20th century. In a setting very much like this one, a woman named Mrs. Donoghue drank a ginger beer that her friend had just purchased for her. Because the bottle was made of dark, opaque glass, no one could see what was inside. As she poured out the last drops, the decomposed remains of a snail tumbled out, and Mrs. Donoghue became ill. Because her friend had paid for the drink, Mrs. Donoghue had no legal contract with the cafe owner and no contract with the manufacturer. Under the rules of the time, she was legally stranded. This photograph shows the historic legislative chamber of the House of Lords. When Mrs. Donoghue's case reached this court in 1932, the judges recognized that the existing law was insufficient. They needed a new framework to hold manufacturers responsible to the people who actually consumed their products. A single hidden snail showed that relying on contracts alone was no longer enough. It compelled the highest court to establish a duty of care that applied even when no formal agreement existed between the producer and the consumer. To bypass the requirement of a contract, Lord Atkin authored what is now famous as the Neighbour principle. He stated that you must take reasonable care to avoid acts or omissions which you can reasonably foresee would be likely to injure your neighbor. In legal terms, your neighbor has nothing to do with physical geography. As the lines on this web show, a neighbor is anyone who is so closely and directly affected by your actions that you should have them in mind when you act. Mrs. Donoghue was the perfect legal neighbor. As the final consumer of a product that could not be inspected before drinking, she was exactly the person who would suffer if the manufacturer failed to keep the product safe. The principle relies on what you can reasonably foresee. The law does not expect people to predict every possible consequence of an action. Instead, it asks whether a hypothetical reasonable person would have seen the potential for harm. In the case of the ginger beer, it is predictable that a contaminated bottle will sicken the person who drinks from it. The harm was a direct result of unsafe production. A duty of care only exists when the relationship between two parties is direct enough and the potential for harm is clear enough that a reasonable person would have considered the risk before acting. Negligence covers two types of behavior: acts and omissions. An act is doing something dangerous, while an omission is failing to take a necessary precaution. The manufacturer's liability in Donoghue stemmed from an omission, the failure to ensure the bottle was clean and safe before it reached the final consumer. Notice the exact phrasing here. The law requires you to take reasonable care, not deliver a guarantee of zero harm. Defendants do not have to ensure that an accident is physically impossible. Establishing that a duty of care exists is only the first step. The claimant must still prove that the defendant failed to meet the required standard of care, and that this failure was what caused the damage. The principle sets a practical threshold. It requires individuals and corporations to implement sensible safety measures without making them liable for every remote or unpredictable accident. By uncoupling civil liability from contract law, the Donoghue ruling changed how the law views responsibility. For the first time, people injured by defective goods could seek compensation from manufacturers they had never met or dealt with directly. Yet the principle contains its own limits. By requiring foreseeability and a direct connection, it prevents the courts from imposing liability for every indirect or distant consequence of a person's actions. Over the decades, the courts have refined this framework. Today, for novel situations without a clear precedent, judges apply the Caparo three-part test, considering foreseeability, proximity, and whether it is fair, just, and reasonable to impose a duty. Despite these newer tests, Lord Atkin's Neighbour principle remains the foundation for all established duties of care in tort law. The case of the snail in the bottle established a new baseline for responsibility. It ensured that whenever someone creates a foreseeable risk, they are legally bound to consider the safety of those who will ultimately be affected.